What if the worst thing that ever happened to you became the reason the world would remember your name forever? Steve Jobs built Apple. Then Apple pushed him out. He lost power. He lost control. And in the eyes of the world, he lost everything. But what happened next didn't just change his life. It changed the future of technology forever. This is the story of why Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. And how that failure became one of the greatest comebacks in business history. Part 1: The Shocking Truth. Most people say Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. That's true, but not in the simple way people think. Steve Jobs wasn't dragged out of the building in one dramatic moment. What really happened was slower, colder, and more painful. In 1985, Apple's board sided with CEO John Sculley in a power struggle over the Macintosh division. Jobs was effectively stripped of control over the team he built, and after being sidelined, he resigned a few months later. Imagine that. Creating something from nothing. Watching it become famous. And then being told you no longer get to lead it. That wasn't just business. For Steve Jobs, that was personal. Part 2: How Apple became Apple. To understand why this happened, you need to understand who Steve Jobs was in the early days. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak co-founded Apple in a garage. What started as a small computer company quickly became one of the most exciting names in tech. Jobs wasn't the engineer people imagine. He was the visionary. He knew how products should feel, how they should look, how they should inspire people. And that vision helped Apple stand out in a world full of boring machines. Then came the Macintosh. When the Mac launched in 1984, it felt revolutionary. It was bold, different, human. But there was one problem. Being revolutionary doesn't always mean being profitable. Part 3: The real reason Steve Jobs lost power. This is where most videos get lazy. Steve Jobs was not removed because he lacked intelligence. He was removed because Apple had become a real business. And businesses get scared when vision moves faster than results. By 1985, the Macintosh was exciting, but it wasn't selling the way Apple hoped. Early Mac strategy was under pressure, while the older Apple II line was still generating the money Apple depended on. Jobs and Sculley clashed over whether to cut Mac pricing and shift advertising away from Apple II. Sculley believed that would hurt the company financially. Steve wanted bold moves. The board wanted safety. Steve wanted the future. The board wanted survival. And when a company feels threatened, it usually chooses the safer voice in the room. Not the loudest dreamer. Part 4: The Betrayal/Power Struggle. Here's where the story turns brutal. Steve Jobs had actually helped bring John Sculley to Apple from Pepsi. Yes, the man who would later help remove him was someone Steve personally recruited. That famous line still echoes today. Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? At first, they were allies. But eventually, they stopped seeing the same future. In 1985, Sculley proposed a reorganization that would take the Macintosh group away from Jobs. According to accounts from Sculley and later summaries, Jobs considered trying to push Sculley out, but the board backed Sculley instead. Jobs was left without real authority. And that may be the most painful kind of defeat. Not losing because you were weak. Losing because the people around you Decided you were too difficult to trust. Part 5, The Failure That Built His Future. After leaving Apple, Steve Jobs did something powerful. He started again. He founded Next. At the time, many people thought it was revenge. And maybe part of it was. But Next became something much more important than a new company. It became Steve Jobs' second education. Next launched in 1985 after Jobs left Apple. Although the hardware business struggled commercially, Next's software platform, Next Step, became highly influential and later formed the technical foundation for Apple's modern operating systems after Apple acquired Next in the late 1990s. That means the company he built after being pushed out would later help rebuild the company that rejected him. Read that again. His setback became his weapon. Part 6, The Return That Changed Everything. Years later, Apple began to struggle. The company that once believed it could move on without Steve Jobs started losing its direction. And in one of the greatest twists in business history, Apple needed the man it once removed. When Apple bought Next in the late 1990s, Steve Jobs returned, and the software from Next became central to Apple's future platform strategy. Commentators widely view that return as a key step in Apple's turnaround. This is what makes the story unforgettable. He didn't come back begging. He came back valuable. That is one of the most important success lessons you can ever learn. When people reject you, don't chase validation. Build something so strong they have to look at you differently later. Part 7, The Deep Life Lesson. Steve Jobs was not destroyed by being fired from Apple. He was refined by it. Before the fall, he was brilliant, but impulsive. After the fall, he became sharper, more patient, more dangerous. Even John Sculley later described the returning Jobs as more mature and a better listener than the younger Jobs 1.0. That's the hidden truth of failure. Failure does not always remove your future. Sometimes it removes your ego. Sometimes it burns away the version of you that would have ruined the bigger destiny ahead. Steve Jobs lost Apple in 1985. But in losing Apple, he found the version of himself that could one day transform it. And maybe that's the real lesson for all of us. The door that closes on you today might be the same door you walk back through one day. Stronger, wiser, and impossible to ignore. So the next time life embarrasses you, rejects you, or removes you from something you thought was yours, remember Steve Jobs. Because sometimes, the moment that looks like the end of your story is actually the beginning of the chapter people will remember forever. If you want more powerful success stories like this, stories about failure, discipline, power, and comeback, subscribe now. Because the next story might change how you see your own struggle.